So my project is on the Qatar World Cup 2022, human rights issues, and how that relates to psychology. So here we go. Now for some background information. It is the biggest, most prestigious, and most watched tournament of all time. It's only around every 4 years, and soccer is the biggest and most influential sport in the world. So it's a pretty big deal. Something interesting is that its previous holders, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Germany, Japan, France, and the US. They're all listed on the screen. And when you look at those countries, they're all pretty big and pretty major world powers. Well, at least in soccer and just their infrastructure. Now, the one standout is South Africa. And the reason why they hosted it is they were the first ever African country. And they got the bid after the rule was made that who hosts the tournament has to rotate throughout the confederations and continents. So, now if you look at Qatar, they've never made a World Cup. They have a very small league and player base, and they only had one stadium appropriate to host before they made the bid. Now, if you look at the other countries, all of them have World Cup experience and had stadiums beforehand of getting their bid. Now, another thing is Qatar is a tiny Arab country off the Gulf Coast. And in my opinion, I never heard of it before they got the bid, and I know a lot of people didn't as well. They have a very small population of less than 3 million people, so having to build 7 new stadiums to house at least 40,000 people made no sense because there's just not enough people to host that much stuff. And finally, the heat in Qatar averages from 99 to 112 Fahrenheit in June and July. And that is the 2 months where the World Cup normally is. So the interesting thing is the World Cup was held in December and November when they hosted it, which just gives you a bit of background information on the whole World Cup. So now the question arises, why was Qatar able to host? And the answer is simple: corruption. Corruption is a big thing throughout soccer and FIFA, and yeah. So basically, Qatar went against bids from Australia, South Korea, and the USA. 3 countries that are huge and have big infrastructures and stadiums, and the US and South Korea had already hosted the World Cup twice. And Australia was looking to host its first, and a lot of people thought that it would go to them. But voters were paid off in different ways. So basically, to host the World Cup, voters from every country and continent get a vote on who gets to host the World Cup. And Qatar and FIFA paid off the members that represented the votes. Qatar's football president, FIFA themselves, and others were found guilty of paying many countries to vote for Qatar. Some of the examples are on the screen: Trinidad, Paraguay, Cameroon, Ivory Coast. A lot of African nations and also a lot of Southeastern Asian countries were found guilty. And this was actually this happened in court in the U.S. And another interesting thing is a Qatar channel, Al Jazeera, paid up to $500 million to FIFA and to get the bid. And that, in my opinion, is wild. So now on to how to build the stadiums. So they had one stadium and they needed 8. Qatar's population was around 3 million. And so basically Qatar brought in 30,000 migrant workers and promised a lot of money for these workers. But once the workers got there, they were only promised $275 a month, and many workers spent upwards of $4,000 to be able to work. So they had to pay for their papers to transfer over, their flights, and a lot of things that ended up costing way more than how much they were paid in the end. So that's just the start of the sketchy stuff that was going on. As I mentioned before, the heat in Qatar is wild. Um, but the thing is, the workers had to work during the summer and not during the winter. And the dry, arid landscape of Qatar makes the heat unbearable, especially to work in and be outside in all day. The hot heat led to an increase of heart problems, including cardiac arrest, multiple sources said. And workers were often given no clean drinking water. And if they did get drinking water, it would not be nearly enough as they needed. And they had limited breaks. So if they got tired, they couldn't stop working. These workers worked from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And while that doesn't sound like a long time, scientists said that the workers should only be outside 15 minutes per hour in that type of heat. So being outside for 6 hours a day in the hot sun, it's going to take a mental and physical toll. While being forced to work in the heat itself is a social injustice, there's a couple more. Malnutrition, for one. They were not given enough food at all in their housing quarters. And another thing is they got in trouble for taking breaks and drinking water during the workday. They wanted them working as much as possible. So people got in trouble and they were threatened to take their wages and all this stuff. Another thing is, I know they said that they worked from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., but a lot of the workers said that oftentimes they did have to work later, and it was in that heat, and that's terrible. Another social injustice was they were lied to about their wages. They were promised a lot of money, and it turns out that their wages were not going to be what they were promised. And also, a lot of people didn't get paid, but I'll talk about that later. And then the final two things are small, cramped housing quarters. And while this looks bad, it's actually pretty common in that part of the world. So it's not terrible, but it's still pretty bad. And then the final thing is the kafala system, which is where I'm going to talk about psychology a little bit. So the kafala system is the legal system regarding employment status in Qatar and many of the other countries in the surrounding Arab Gulf Coast area. Since its introduction, it has stroken up controversy as many recognize the exploitation that it involves. What it means in Qatar is the employment and immigration status of employees are entirely controlled by private citizens and companies rather than the government, like most countries. Some relate workers to indentured servants in this system, as it is poorly regulated and lacks protection for workers, allowing this exploitation. This shows the power difference between the employer and the worker. This power difference can incite stress and anxiety as they're being forced to work in these harsh conditions while being exploited. In extreme cases of stress, like what the workers faced, they could enter stage 3 of the general adaptation syndrome, or exhaustion. After such a long time of working in these stressful conditions, workers most likely enter this stage, and this can lead to death, illness, and other permanent damages to the body. While some serious stress can be good, it is not good over a long time period, as we learned in class. This has led to a numerous amount of cases of deaths and hospitalizations, clearly showing a social injustice falling under the category of physical and psychological safety. Now, while the exact number of deaths and hospitalizations cannot be confirmed, any amount is way too far. I'll talk more in the next slide about how watching the death and hospitalizations hurt other workers, but the power dynamic that the kafala system allows was not good for the employees. They could have felt helpless and powerless, which is not good for their mental health. Now I'm going to talk about chronic stress and PTSD in workers. So the first thing that happens in one's brain when experiencing extreme amounts of stress is to either fight or to flee, the fight or flight response. In this case, the workers could do neither. Once workers arrived from their countries, they were not able to leave, as thanks to the kafala system, their passports and their immigration status was completely under their control. They were essentially under complete control of whoever hired them, and this obviously caused a serious amount of stress, as once they saw the working conditions, they wanted to leave. A specific example of this is the case of Anish Adhikari from Nepal. He was one of the many that took out loans and went into mountains of debt with the promise of good pay and good working conditions in Qatar. Once he got there, though, he realized that he got himself into trouble. He talked to others, learning that some paychecks never came. He saw the crowded housing that the workers had to stay in, and once he started to work, he realized that the heat without breaks and water were going to take a toll. The problem was, he could not leave. Even if he was able to get all of his papers and documents to travel back home, he was in so much debt that he could not, thus not being able to enact the flight response. He was not able to enact the flight response either, as the employers were not willing to make any change and always said that they could leave with their debt if they wanted to, even though they really couldn't. Anish said that he and other workers were constantly worried and overworked, two clear signs of experiencing chronic stress. When you experience chronic stress, high levels of cortisol are released, which can lead to a weaker immune system and depression. Also, chronic stress can lead to a various number of psychological disorders such as PTSD and major depressive disorder. Anish also said that he had to watch one of his coworkers die. He saw him fall from the top level of the stadium without being secured, a sight that he had to relive a number of times, which is a sign of PTSD. And on the screen, there's two quotes. The second one is in regards to Anish having to rethink about his coworker dying and relive that. Now, for my final psychology topic, I will be talking about the social identity theory. So, what this theory states is that individuals categorize themselves and others based on shared characteristics. This creates one in-group, and in this case, that is the group of higher-ups in Qatar that ran the building of the stadiums and the employers. And then there's also the out-group. And in this case, that is the workers, as they are deemed as different because they are not from Qatar and are only temporarily working there. They were being oppressed and mistreated, and the Qatari nationals or employers were easily able to do this with partial thanks to the social identity theory. The out-group, while largely outnumbering the in-group, was isolated in the fact that most of them left their homes and families for this job and had to go a long time without seeing them, and also being surrounded by a bunch of people that they didn't know and weren't from the same country as. They also could not complain or join a union together, as the employers did not tolerate that, and unions practically are non-existent, even though they're technically allowed, due to the amount of the power that the employers have in Qatar. This social identity theory allows employers to discriminate and keep power at the top. The employees could not join together and fight for better, as they started off screwed, essentially. I mean, they couldn't leave, they weren't getting paid, and there were terrible working conditions. So all those things considered, they had no power, thus proving that the social identity theory was in place. Now, there were some questionable responses from FIFA after all the alleged claims. FIFA has written to 32 teams competing and telling them to now focus on the football. It said the sport should not be dragged into ideological or political battles or hand out moral lessons. This is a clear case of the social identity theory, as FIFA wanted to minimize the social justice issues that happened to the workers, as FIFA wanted to look good. They wanted to look on top, and essentially they just thought that the workers were lesser people, and with the help of their in-group, the investors of the World Cup, the managers of FIFA, and all the higher-ups wanted to cover everything up because they wanted this tournament to be as good and great as possible. Also, FIFA knows that they messed up, but the success of the actual World Cup hid a lot of the controversy and social justice issues that happened at the start, just because of how much publicity the whole tournament brings. Now here's a question. Has there been any justice since this social injustice? And the answer is no. It's been 6 months since the tournament concluded, but FIFA and Qatar have yet to offer an effective and accessible scheme to enable abused workers to receive the justice and compensation they are owed. So basically, a bunch of people did not get paid, and it's not just them not getting paid, but they were abused, they were overworked, they were mistreated, so they should be getting paid for that as well. but they're not. And then Qatar's existing mechanism for redress is not fit for purpose and has left thousands of workers deprived of compensation for the abuses that they suffered. And that's from Amnesty International, from an article. So there has not been any justice. Now, in conclusion, overall, the human injustices that occurred in Qatar in preparation of the World Cup, they were horrific and they were unjustified. The psychological damage that happened to the employees had a great effect, and they happened because of the social identity theory, the kafala system, and chronic stress that they experienced. While the World Cup itself, the soccer part, was a major success, I believe that what happened surrounding it was horrible, and in my opinion, it should be talked about more, and the employees should be getting compensation for what they went through. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the long video. I did not expect it to be this long.